Hello and welcome to In It, a podcast for families with kids who learn and think differently.
Here you'll find advice, camaraderie, stories of successes, and yes, sometimes failures from experts and from parents and caregivers like you.
I'm Gretchen Vierstra, a former classroom teacher and an editor here at understood.org.
And I'm Rachel Bozek, a writer, editor, and mom who has definitely been in it. Today we're getting into some hard but important truths around ADHD, substance use, and addiction.
For this conversation, we're bringing back Roberto Olivardia, a Massachusetts-based clinical psychologist with more than 20 years of experience evaluating people for things like ADHD. He's also someone who himself was diagnosed with ADHD as an adult.
A quick note before we get started. This is a serious topic and may hit close to home for some. If you or someone you're caring for is struggling with substance use or addiction, there are excellent resources available on the government website for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Go to samhsa.gov/find-help. And as always, if you or someone you know is in crisis, you can reach a reliable crisis helpline by dialing or texting 988. Okay, now let's get into it.
Roberto, welcome back to In It.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me again.
We are so excited to have you here today. And as you know, we're talking today about the risks of substance use for kids with ADHD.
Yes.
And I'm thinking maybe we should dive right into the deep end and talk about addiction. Are kids with ADHD at a higher risk for addiction? And if so, why? Is there a biological reason for that? Something to do with their brains? What's going on?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to understand the chemistry of ADHD, that in general, when an ADHD brain gets rewarded, it wants a lot more of that reward. I mean, certainly for anybody, when it gets rewarded, we sort of might lean towards that thing. But with ADHD, because the brain is always craving stimulation, when we like something, and I say we, I have ADHD, when we are stimulated or rewarded by something, we run the risk of liking it too much without sort of proper boundaries.
So how different is this predisposition for someone with ADHD as compared to the general population?
So to give you some just quick stats, people with ADHD are 2 to 3 times more likely to have a substance abuse or dependency issue. Having ADHD doubles the risk of nicotine dependence. It could triple the risk of alcohol dependence across all substances. Studies that look at various substance-dependent populations find about 20% have ADHD.
Wow.
Now, that's where it's identified and diagnosed. ADHD, despite people thinking it's overdiagnosed, studies show that it's still vastly underdiagnosed, particularly in older people, because of just the identification and what we knew about ADHD years ago, versus now. So there is definitely a higher risk, and I think it's always important for parents who have kids with ADHD to, one, know that, and then two, we can start to talk to our kids, when they're young, and it doesn't have to be about drugs or alcohol, because I should also say that it's a much higher risk of any addictive behavior. So we might be talking about substances, but we run a higher risk of binge eating disorder, of gambling addiction, I work with a lot of young men with ADHD who are addicted to pornography, to impulsive spending. So all of these things that have what we call a dopaminergic effect, which is that it's increasing levels of dopamine in the brain.
I can imagine some parents or caregivers listening right now wishing they could unhear everything you're saying. Like, I don't really want to know this about my child's brain chemistry.
So it does start with sort of a neurochemical basis. And why it's so important to understand that is just generally and culturally, we tend to moralize addiction in this country, which is so not right and appropriate. And we often associate this with an aspect of willpower. And the truth is, not all brains are designed the same. I intimately understand how easy it could be to fall into something that on one level is not good, but your brain is somehow getting rewarded by that.
Yeah.
Not everybody has that predisposition or that tendency. So that's great. If you don't have that tendency, life is a lot easier at least on that level. But we want to take that sort of moral piece away and just look at this as like a chemical issue. So the ADHD brain, in a nutshell, has deficits in dopamine regulation and processing. In simple terms, they're kind of lower available dopamine. So it's the ADHD brain is at baseline a bored brain. So what a lot of substances do, like cannabis, which is one of the most abused substances that I see amongst people with ADHD, is it elevates levels of dopamine. You have impulse control issues for people with ADHD. So where someone without ADHD might want to engage in something, but they pause because they can see the consequences that can come from that. For someone with ADHD, they might not be as aware in that moment of those consequences. An ADHD brain is always sensation seeking. But also from a psychological level, people with ADHD often can struggle with self-esteem issues. And sometimes substance use is a way of self-medicating that. Now, what's interesting, a colleague, Mass General Hospital, his name is Timothy Willens, Wilens. Dr. Willens has done a lot of research in the ADHD community looking specifically at ADHD and substance use. And through his studies have found that about 30% of people with ADHD report using drugs and alcohol to get a high, whereas 70% actually report using it to self-medicate ADHD symptoms. So my patients who have ADHD who are using substances will say, alcohol helps me get to sleep. This substance helps me focus. I am just riddled with all these negative thoughts of thinking how stupid I am, that the drugs sort of numb me out. So what we're learning is that from a psychological level, in addition to all the physiological levels, that people with ADHD are more likely at risk to use these substances to self-medicate the ADHD. And also, aside from the higher predisposition, and this is also really, really important, is the bridge between experimentation and abuse or dependence is much shorter for people with ADHD. And I say this to young people I work with. I have two children, a 19 and 17-year-old, who both have ADHD. I said, the fact is, like, your peers are going to be engaging in this, and a lot of them won't develop a problem with it. And I'm, certainly not advocating the use of it, but they're not going to have an issue with it. Just know that we run a higher risk of having an issue with it, that something that's just an innocent sort of experimentation could turn into a very bad habit very, very quickly with ADHD. And that's just the reality of it.
When people with ADHD understand all this about their brains and their chemistry, do you find that it affects how they think and feel about themselves?
Definitely, because even with, patients of mine who have ADHD who, and again, going back to understanding that could broaden to a lot of addictive behaviors, it's not uncommon, and I've seen this particularly with adults who were undiagnosed ADHD or where their ADHD was not really properly treated, who might have had, let's say, a drug or alcohol problem, achieve sobriety, which is an enormous feat and accomplishment, and then developed a binge eating disorder, then developed a gambling addiction, and then maybe worked through that, and then developed another issue, and leaving them feeling, what is wrong with me? And either feeling broken or feeling like they lack any sense of will, as opposed to understanding, no, this is the same kind of animal here. It's just manifesting in different ways. And to know that that same sort of part of us, like I often think of these things like a coin, the heads and the tails, the same part of us that can have us run the risk of getting addicted to certain things, I feel is also responsible for the things that we can feel like super passionately about and have a zest for. That same kind of quality and flavor of when we hook into something. Like if you get me started to talk about music, we can be here all day because it is... there's no question if you hooked my brain up when I'm at a show, at a concert, which I go to as often as I can, or even listening to music, you're going to see a lot of dopaminergic activity. So it's understanding that it's not like even when people achieve sobriety, that they're kind of different people. That way of about you is there. It's just being very careful to making sure you're funneling that into things that are healthy, things that are appropriate, things that aren't going to get you into any trouble.
So I feel like this question might be kind of complicated, but I'm going to keep it as simple as possible. When someone is self-medicating with something that we wouldn't ordinarily think that people should, quote, should take, and it's making them feel better, in that case, is it a bad thing?
It's a great question. So this is why even in approaching this, whether you're a parent, a clinician, we don't want to demonize the person for having, the problem, because the first question to ask is, what is this doing for you? Because they even if they know they're engaging in something that they probably shouldn't be, it's hearing, okay, it's rewarding you. And to understand, and this is specifically an issue when it comes to cannabis, because you have now cannabis, which is legalized in many states, and not only is a substance that is seen as not harmful, which is not true. It's neurologically very harmful to especially a developing brain, but it's being marketed as being medicinal. It's being marketed as being actually helpful. And I'll have a lot of young people I work with who's like, oh, isn't this a treatment? Like, this would be better than amphetamines, which people can get hooked on, which isn't true. The risk of addiction for someone with ADHD for stimulant medication is very, very low. And my great friend and colleague and ADHD expert, Ari Tuckman, says it best when he said, if stimulant medication was that addictive, people with ADHD would never forget ever taking their medication.
Right. Good point.
and would never forget making sure their prescription is filled and meeting with the psychiatrist to do that. Good point. But it's delivered just differently in the ADHD brain. Mm-hmm. So what we know about cannabis in particularly is, yes, it's doing all of those things. And we want to validate to the person, yes, it may be helping you sleep and it may be calming you down. It might make your thoughts sort of more linear. And what we also know is that it's eroding those executive centers in the brain that is only working to exacerbate those ADHD symptoms in the long term. So in the moment, yes, it's doing those things, and it doesn't mean it's good for you.
Right. So do ADHD medications make addiction less likely?
Even when talking about this, and what I get so frustrated by is still this kind of all these cultural misperceptions about what ADHD is. So even in sobriety circles, there are some rehabilitation programs that count stimulant use for someone with ADHD, even when prescribed, as a violation of sobriety, which is so offensive to people with ADHD. What we know, and this is empirical research, again, a lot of credit to Dr. Willens for doing these studies. Studies show for people with ADHD, the use of stimulant treatment reduces the risk of relapse. Even with young children and teens who have ADHD, that when they do longitudinal studies following them over the years, find that those who are taking medication are less likely to develop a substance use problem and issue. And it makes sense because, again, if you are getting properly treated, and so much of what's feeding into the substance use disorder are these ADHD symptoms, impulse control, just even proper, focus and concentration, the need for stimulation. If you just overall feel more grounded, which is what proper treatment, pharmacological treatment of ADHD would achieve, there's less of sort of the need for that, in that way. So yes, and I get it. For parents, you hear these concerns about Adderall and a lot of these medications, keeping in mind that people who don't have ADHD, these drugs are very addictive because it does a very different thing in the brain. If you're using it as prescribed, the risk is very, very low. I can honestly tell you, and I've seen lots of patients with ADHD. I know lots of people in my life with ADHD. I've only come across maybe one client who abused their stimulant medication. So it wasn't taking it as prescribed, that they were abusing it. I never see it. And it's because it's delivered differently in the brain.
So when should you start talking to your kid with ADHD about the dangers of substance use for them? And how should parents talk about it?
Yeah, I think it's so important, just even at young ages, before substance is even in the vocabulary, of just, educating about ADHD. And part of that is, we might have a hard time, regulating, although that word is too big of a word when they're young. But when we like something, it's hard to stop, something that we really like. And when we don't like something, it's really hard to start, and want to, do that thing. And kind of start to create a space of not only them, but share, whether you have ADHD or not, of, like, for example, when like I love food and, daddy loves pizza. And sometimes if there's more slices to be had, I have to say, oh, like I could eat a large pizza easily. But how I'm going to feel afterwards might not be good. And you sort of drop those examples. And because it's also helpful when kids know that this isn't something just about them. When mom or dad, caregiver, is talking about this, oh, okay, well, they look up to their, caregiver. And it could be, oh, we love watching TV. We love playing video games. And it is hard to stop because we like it so much. But we kind of have to, because we have to go to bed and we have to do these things. And so you start to introduce that idea. And then again, I'm all about this sort of strength-based model of that same thing means, like, when you're connected to something that you love, like what my kids heard growing up is, like, I love what I do. Like, I don't call this a job because it almost seems like, is it a job? Like, I love it. Like, I love what I do. And I can work long days and I don't leave the office at the end of the day being like, oh, what a long day. I'm energized by it. So you want to sort of have them see sort of the full picture of it. And then as they get older and, depending on who your kid is, like I was, the kind of kid, I learned a lot too young. I had a lot of friends in the neighborhood who were older. And, I grew up at a time where you weren't as supervised as, right. I think now that you are. So there was exposure there to me at a very young age, like much younger than, my parents would have thought. And the truth is now, like cannabis, for example, I'm working with 11 and 12-year-olds who are engaging in the use of cannabis, who know lots of their peers who are using weed. So to not assume that at 13, they're not seeing that kind of, exposure. So then it starts to be like, as you get older, you're going to see lots of different things. And some of those are, alcohol and drugs. And I think to approach it, one, as, again, not moralizing it, because I think a lot of times we're like, oh, only bad people, the bad kids, or, the kids whose parents aren't supervising them or doing drugs. And that's not true. Like, there are really good people who get themselves wrapped into these, things. And so it is this balance of saying, one of the things we know about ADHD is there is a higher risk for these kinds of problems. Now, I also say the majority of people with ADHD do not have a drug or alcohol problem. However, if you take samples of people with drug and alcohol problems, you're going to see a higher than normal rate of people with ADHD. And so it's just to let them know, like, that you're going to be confronted with these kinds of things. And I want to be clear about that these things aren't helpful, and not just because they're wrong and I'm thinking for those of you who are South Park fans, like, when Mr. Mackey be like, drugs are bad, drugs are bad. And it's like, because as an ADHD kid, sometimes the things that I was told not to do were more attractive. Like, those were the things that were sort of more appealing. So the thing that I hear most from young people I work with that prevents them from really engaging those conversations is if they feel there's judgment made
Right. Yeah.
against peers who, because a lot of my patients, even the ones that are not using drugs or alcohol, have friends who are using drugs and alcohol. And if they fear that if their parents either will look down upon their friends or by association start to look down on their child for having association with those people.
Yeah. In talking about all of this, is the message that they should never, ever touch any kind of, drugs and alcohol, like, even when they're of age because of this potential tendency, or not?
So, I mean, we wouldn't have a blanket statement to say, oh, you should never, ever, ever do it. But I mean, I can tell you as a parent, I strongly promoted total sobriety because there is addiction on both sides of my kids' family. My maternal grandfather and maternal uncle died of alcoholism. And I know myself and, situations in my life and just how I'm wired. And I told them, like, I will never, ever think of you less or, that's and it goes with, as parents, it will go without saying, but your kid might not know. They might think, they're going to vastly disappoint you. And I always want my kid to know at the end of the day, if you make a certain choice and decision, you always can call me. Always call me. The first question is not going to be, why did you do that? And that sort of thing. And what I would promote is if you engage in it, you want to be safe, but really be honest and pay attention, because in some ways, if it makes you feel so good, we want to really be cautious of that. Let's find a way to talk about that. And I won't be like, oh my gosh, why did you do that? And so it's balancing that. And yeah, like I wouldn't say never from the perspective of, because then if your child does engage in the use, they don't want to feel like I would never say to my kids, like, don't ever drink, don't ever do that. Yeah. But I worked as a parent and with my clients is building assertiveness skills, how to, be in a situation where you can still be, with those kids if they're funny and they're like, because a lot of my friends engaged in that and I didn't have to. And at the same time, I liked them because they were funny and they had a lot of, so how do you build assertiveness skills to be able to say, oh, no, thank you. And, I can appreciate other aspects here of the relationship and the friendship. So that's how I would do it. So how do you build assertiveness? And I think, again, what I hear from a lot of the young people is even with peers, a lot of times, even when with peer pressure and things like that, it's often around the judgment. Like if you come across, I'm not judging you for if you like to drink and whatnot. I mean, I might have concerns secretly, and I did. I had friends who struggled with this, that, but I'm not thinking of you as a less of a person or anything like that. A lot of times peers sort of lay off, It's, I think, when they start to feel judged by somebody who makes the decision to be sober, to not engage.
Yeah. Can you give an example? What, if I were to talk to my kid about, okay, here are the words you should use when you're trying to not engage, but you don't want to offend your friends. What are some sentence starters or conversation ideas you can give your kids?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes, my kids, and are very open, they say we have a pretty high risk of addiction, in my family. And it's something I just want to be careful about. For some people might not feel as comfortable saying that. And so they might say, oh, I don't like the feeling of being out of control. Or I have a client who, he said, and he actually does get motion sick very easily, on boats and stuff like that. And he says he really doesn't want to drink, and he uses that. He says, I get motion sick, and he makes it. He's very funny. He's like, it'll be like a vomitorium, here in 2 seconds just by me being dizzy, and it works. And the thing is people okay, cool,
yeah.
So in our last minute or two that we have, is there anything we didn't get to that you feel is important to include here?
Yeah, I guess I just want to really highlight and underline how important the identification of ADHD when ADHD is in the fold, how important that is to diagnose, how important it is to understand the full range of that. Because a lot of times in other circles, when ADHD is talked about as just an issue of attention, just an issue of academics. And we know, and understood in places that it can affect every domain. And why I'm appreciative of this dialogue and this conversation we're having is that when people can get that diagnosis and get treatment, and I've seen it so much, like just with people, because sobriety is so hard. It's so hard. I mean, and it's such an amazing accomplishment when someone can achieve sobriety. And when they know that there's this additional tool of treatment for ADHD that can make that process and that road easier for them, it feels like you won the lottery, in that way. And that's what I want people to sort of, be aware of. And at the end of the day, whatever choices people make, around substances, of course, I want people safe and living long, healthy lives. But even in having these conversations, and as a parent, what I try to convey is I want you to just have the facts. Let's just be accurate as much as we can here, because I would be remiss if I didn't share this with you, because I work with people who have, who are in recovery, and they said, I wish somebody told me that having ADHD had even something to do with addiction or a binge eating issue or, you name it. Like sometimes that is like an epiphany for people where I want that to be common knowledge and not, again, from the perspective of scaring people, but just educating them. And I think for anybody, whether you have ADHD or not, that's just so important. The more knowledge you have of yourself, the more then at least you're going into decisions with accurate information.
Knowledge is power.
Knowledge is power.
Oh, well, thank you so much. This has been such a helpful conversation.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate us having the conversation.
Thanks so much for listening today. If you have any thoughts about the episode, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at init@understood.org.
And check out the show notes for this episode, where we have more resources and links to anything we mentioned.
This show is brought to you by understood.org. Understood is a nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering people with learning and thinking differences like ADHD and dyslexia. Learn more at understood.org.
In It is produced and edited by Julie Subrin, with additional production support from Cody Nelson and Ash Beecher. Justin D. Wright mixes the show, and Mike Errico wrote our theme music. Brianna Berry is our production director. Neil Drumming is our editorial director.
From understood.org, our executive directors are Laura Key, Scott Coshier, and Seth Melnick. Thanks for listening.
And thanks for always being in it with us.